Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I am Professor of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Theology, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our panel. And before we get started, I'd like to say a little bit about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross and the college, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. This academic year, we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the center, as well as the 40th anniversary of the Madeleva Lecture. This annual lecture, which features prominent women scholars in the fields of theology, history, and spirituality, was part of the original vision for the work of the center that Dr. Keith Egan had proposed in 1984. Each of these important lectures has also been published as a small book in a series by Paulist Press, which is a tradition that continues to this day. As part of this celebration year, we have convened 3 panels of previous Madeleva lecturers. This evening is the first of 3 facilitated discussions with our esteemed Madeleva Lecture alumni. It is my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Julia Fetter, the Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality and Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theology, who will introduce our honored guests and host our event this evening. Julia.
Hello, everyone. I am really delighted to have the honor of introducing our 3 panelists. First is Elizabeth Johnson, CSJ. She is Distinguished Professor of Theology Emerita at Fordham University in New York City. After receiving a PhD at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., she taught there for 10 years before moving to Fordham. For over half a century, her work as a theologian has included teaching, mentoring, research and writing, editing, and public lecturing to church and academic groups at home and abroad. A former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and also of the American Theological Society and Ecumenical Association, Dr. Johnson has published numerous books and essays in scholarly and popular journals. Her work has been translated into 13 languages: Spanish, German, Portuguese, Italian, French, Dutch, Polish, Icelandic, Lithuanian, Bosnian, Korean, Indonesian, and Thai. Dr. Johnson loves to teach and received the Fordham Graduate Professor of the Year Award. Among other awards are 15 honorary doctorates, the John Courtney Murray Award for Excellence in Theology, the Grawemeyer Award for her book, She Who Is, The Mystery of God in Feminist Theological Discourse. After her retirement from Fordham, Fordham inducted her into the university's Hall of Honor. Her most recent book, Come Have Breakfast, Meditations on God and the Earth, develops the theme of her Madeleva Lecture in a new key. Our second panelist is Mary Catherine Hilkert, a Dominican Sister of Peace, and she is the Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Her areas of teaching and research include theological anthropology, revelation and faith, feminist and multicultural theologies, Christology, and the relationship between theology, spirituality, and preaching. She is the author of Naming Grace, Preaching and the Sacramental Imagination, Speaking with Authority, Catherine of Siena and the Voices of Today, of Women Today, and most recently, A Time to Keep Silence and A Time to Speak. In addition, she is co-editor of The Praxis of the Reign of God, an Introduction to the Theology of Edward Skilebex, and has published numerous articles in scholarly and pastoral journals of theology and spirituality. a former president of Catholic Theological Society of America, Dr. Hilkert was awarded the Society's highest honor for distinguished achievement in theology, the John Courtney Mary Award, this past June. She has been the recipient of 4 honorary degrees, the Great Preacher Award from Aquinas Institute of Theology, and a number of other awards recognizing her contributions to the integration of academic and pastoral theology, with particular attention to the voices of women. A member of the advisory board for Catholic Women Preach, Dr. Hilkert has preached and offered lectures and workshops in Catholic and ecumenical contexts in the United States, Canada, Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Australia, and South Africa. Our third panelist is Nancy Pineda-Madrid. Nancy Pineda-Madrid's lineage consists of a family who for generations has lived in the Chihuahua Desert, a family who experienced the border crossing them. She is president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and is the T. Marie Chilton Chair of Catholic Theology at Loyola Marymount University, where she has taught since 2019. She holds a PhD in systematic and philosophical theology. She has published 2 monographs, Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez, and the first book to offer a theological interpretation of suffering and salvation in the midst of evil, tragic killing of women known as feminicide. And her second book, Theologizing in an Insurgent Key, Violence, Women, and Salvation, deepens her work on salvation and is part of the Madeleva Lectures in Spirituality. Her current book project is on Our Lady of Guadalupe. She is co-editor of 2 additional volumes, Hope, Promise, Possibility, and Fulfillment, and The Holy Spirit, Setting the World on Fire. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband, Larry Gordon. So welcome, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Hilkert, and Dr. Pineda-Madrid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
To start off, I wonder if each of you would tell us a little bit about the topic and the argument of your Madeleva lecture. I'm wondering, how did each of you think about your topic at the time that you chose them? So I'm wondering if we could begin with Dr. Johnson, since your lecture came first in 1993.
Right. So when I was invited to give this lecture, I was enormously pleased to have the opportunity to concentrate on a subject that was very dear to my heart, but I had had no time to think about it, namely the connection between women and the earth and the creator spirit of God. Already in the 80s and even in the 70s, feminist work and ecofeminism in particular had drawn very tight link between the way women are demeaned and nature is demeaned in patriarchal thinking and behavior. Women and nature were subordinate to men, were supposed to be at their service, and so on and so forth. And what kept coming to me is a third link intertwined with those two, namely how our understanding of God is also subordinating the feminist and feminine qualities of God, aspects, images, and so on, in favor of masculine images of God. I had just finished writing She Who Is, calling God female names. And so I wanted to take what feminist work had done on women and nature and broaden it to include God in the problem and also God in the way that it could, we need to think differently. We need to expand our understanding of God using female and cosmic images as well as male images in order to begin to unravel this oppressive kind of mental system that we just inherited without questioning. So the title of my lecture was Women, Earth, and Creator Spirit. And I took each in turn and tried to undo the hierarchical dualism that was built in to how we traditionally have thought of all of the 3 of them together.
Dr. Hilkert, maybe you might go next.
Thanks, Julia. Well, I actually entered into this line of wonderful colleagues and the women who've gone before me and those who followed. I've been at almost all of the Madeleva lectures since I teach at Notre Dame right across the street. I think only one I missed while I was out of town at the time. Also, I just want to say what a gift it is to do this tonight with Beth and with Nancy. The last time the three of us did something I can think of really significant together was a trip to Jerusalem. So it's just great to be back in conversation here. And Julia, too. Thank you so much. So I entered into this line of speakers as a preacher, actually, because in 2025, no, I'm sorry, I'm up to, it is 2025, right? No, but what year? June of 2000, I guess it was the year 2000. The decision was made that rather than having one Madeleva lecturer, that they would invite back, Keith Egan, so also a heads off to Keith with the inspiration for this whole series. And I think I was the last one that he invited and saw me through the process. Had the idea that they would regather the 16 Madeleva lecturers who had been invited. There were really 15. I was proleptic. I was coming up the next year, okay? So they had been invited to speak a message of hope and courage to women in the church, reflecting on the diversity of gifts bestowed on us by the Spirit. And I had been invited to be the preacher at that event. I was not one of them, and therefore I also to participate in the convergence that took place. I won't take the time right now since our question is more about our own individual lecture, but I would say to you, there's an excellent article in America Magazine, readily available online, that another of the Madeleva lecturers, Elizabeth Dreyer, wrote that detailed how that process went that weekend and how we ended up with the Madeleva manifesto. And that article is called "In the Tradition of Sister Madeleva, the Convergence 2000 Gathering Leads to a Proclamation of Hope." All right. So I was invited to preach, and it turned out to be, in addition, the feast of Catherine of Siena. And it was all set, and I had prepared, and the priest who was presiding was very enthusiastic about it also. And then the week before that, we found out that there was a glitch about my preaching after the gospel, which I won't go into those specifics here either, but it was from the beginning, not only by being part of the Order of Preachers and having done my dissertation on preaching and a previous book on preaching, but now here it was again, at this invitation and at this trying to offer a message of hope and courage to young women. And it was that passage from John that began with the disciples gathered together behind locked doors for fear, where you get Thomas, our twin, and that version of the resurrection narrative. So that's my history of how I became involved in it. As a result, I really had another topic in mind. I actually remember it. I didn't have a detailed outline of it yet, but it was going to be women as the body of Christ. And I began working on that, and I had a sabbatical coming up, or a research leave that year. So for my own spiritual reading, I decided to focus on reading in depth Catherine of Siena's dialogue, which I regret to admit to you, I never had read previously cover to cover, and her prayers. And I still have not worked my way through at least the scholarly edition of all of her letters. But so that was just for me. And she just took over. I mean, that's the way I would explain how I came to shift the topic. I remember talking to Beth. I don't know if you remember this conversation, Beth, but I told you I had shifted it and I was going to talk on speaking with authority, Catherine of Siena and the voices of women today. And you said to me, Kathy, think about this. You don't have a medieval Italian, which I didn't and don't. And, you had, et cetera. So we had this wonderful exchange, as we always do. But Catherine was unrelenting. And the topic really just engaged me. And so I began my lecture. I did stay with speaking with authority. By the way, also, when it was ready to go to press, it was suggested to me, you might use the title of your second chapter in the book, which is to speak the truth in the authority of speaking the truth in love. And maybe you'd want to use speaking the truth in love rather than speaking with authority. I said, no, this is a book that speaking with authority. All right. So those are some sort of personal insights and inspirations from my patron saint. The subtitle, Catherine of Siena and the Voices of Women Today. And I began it with the Madeleva Manifesto, which I will not read now, but Dan just, I could see posted in the chat room that there's access to that on the center's website. But we called it the Madeleva Manifesto, a message of hope and courage. All right. It was a wonderful convergence. So the bottom line was that in 1970, the first person to be named a doctor of the church was Teresa of Avila. And I had been asked to preach on her feast at Catholic U, where I was a graduate student. And in doing so, I looked up to be sure what qualifies somebody to be a doctor of the church. And in the previous edition of the New Catholic Encyclopedia, which you would not find now if you go to fact check this, but it then had a description. It means to be a person of great learning, eminent sanctity, and to be so recognized by the church. And after listing the male doctors of the church, it said Teresa of Avila has popularly been promoted and recognized by the people as fitting these qualifications, but it's unlikely that any woman would ever be so named because that would make her part of the magisterium.
Right.
So if you get the first copy of my Speaking with Authority, in the footnote there, you can check that in that historic version. So that, of course, got me thinking, well, Catherine of Siena was the second and named the same year, right? She's the only lay woman of the four current doctors of the church, female doctors of the church, and a young woman. So all of that said to me, this is a living witness to encourage hope and courage for especially younger women, which had been our task. And then the way I structured it, it was wonderful as I was, had the time to read in depth those works with this project in mind. And so I eventually organized it into 3 chapters. My question was, of course, since she was explicitly recognized for her charism, her mystical wisdom, and her charism for exhortation, which is one way of thinking of preaching. All right, so I'm saying, what enabled this young, lay, fairly uneducated woman of the 14th century to speak with the authority with which she did speak, which I recognized immediately when I went to the letters, and the scholar Karen Scott certainly pointed this out in a wonderful article, that she would talk about, in the name of gentle Mary and Christ crucified and Io Caterina and I Catherine, or she'd have a Trinitarian beginning, but each time it was, and she too was speaking with authority. So bottom line was, where did that authority come from? And So the 3 chapters in both the original version and a later version, I'll say more about that when we come back to those, but it struck me, it was her sense of authority rooted in her vocation, her sense of vocation, her deep mystical prayer and relationship with Christ, really with the Trinity. And she says it in one letter, for instance, to her mother, who was wondering about this young woman running around the Tuscan countryside with a band of followers preaching everywhere and on her way to speak to the Pope up in Avignon about getting himself back to Rome. She says to her mother, "My Creator has elected me to do this." I mean, and that's just one of many, many passages where she speaks with a great sense that this is a call. It's a vocation. It's not even one she particularly wanted initially, but again, I don't want to take too much of the time. So I'll just say the other 2 chapters with the authority of wisdom. And I thought she's recognized for her mystical wisdom. And so, and that one I did subtitle Speaking the Truth in Love. So many of you know the boldness with which she spoke about, the poor choice of some of the pastors of the church. And she's writing to the Pope and saying they were meant to be flowers in the garden of the church, but instead they're stinking weeds, is one translation. Or, I mean, some very bold, or even to him saying, he has all the authority. She respects it totally. She is obedient to the Pope. But if he can't exercise his authority in the way that Christ did, he should resign. And that's in a letter that begins, "Dearest Babbo," so with this very familiar term, and yet. So she's amazing. So there's a lot more to be said in that chapter, but another just key point I would point out is that this wisdom, she also says to him that he has all the authority in the world or in the church, final say, but he only has the insight of one person still, and how he needs a council of advisors. And she's recommending that. Again, we could come back to that later, but so that certainly intrigued me. And then the final chapter, which was the hardest to write, because it's one that I knew I wasn't saying exactly what Catherine was saying, and yet I didn't want to be just anachronistic and making a Catherine of Siena in the image of a 20th century, at that point, feminist theologian, right, or preacher. But so the last one is the authority of compassion. And it really is that her authority was very much rooted in her sense of being rooted deeply in the blood of Christ, on her relationship with Christ crucified. So, and there were practices she had that I certainly didn't want to exhort, and some of which she did not exhort at the end of her life. She's known for her radical asceticism. A book by Rudolph Bell calls it Holy Anorexia, or includes her in that category. But she had some other rather bizarre ascetical practices, which we wouldn't want to exhort today. So, but I really pressed it in terms of, and I'll stop with this as far as this insight from the 3rd chapter. What I found in her, and I continue to wrestle with today, is a kind of, I would still be willing to talk about the wisdom, even the wisdom of the cross. All right. But her being rooted in Christ crucified, for her, she calls him mad lover, who only love where the nails, love was what nailed him to the cross, and laying down his life for his friends, going. So there's a whole way of I think reinterpreting Catherine's wisdom of compassion rooted in the cross. And so I tried to rethink that and mentioned that I was rethinking it. And I shared it with 2 well-known Catharinian scholars, Mary O'Driscoll and certainly Suzanne Nofke, and asked them to call me on it if they thought I was putting in her mouth. And they both said, you're using her as a lens and you're doing a contemporary project. And they thought it was very fair and faithful. And Suzanne told me very helpful. So that's the structure. Thank you.
Wow. So I can just jump in here. That's amazing. It's so amazing to hear both you, Beth and Kathy, and the work that you've done in your thinking. And as I think about my own Madeleva lecture, I gave it in 2019, and it grows out of the work that I had started doing more than 10 years before. This first book I wrote, Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez, really got me focused on violence against women, and the most severe violence against women, namely feminicide, the killing of women because they are women. And realizing that when we confront evil, obviously it really is a confrontation that forces us to think about what does it mean to believe in the God who saves in the face of evil. And for me, the question of salvation has always been an overarching question that drives a lot of my own thinking. And so when I also should acknowledge, I grew up in El Paso, Texas. So I grew up on the border and was very attached to the border community and certainly to Juarez. And coming out of all of that in my first book, I realized, this feminicide, which I thought was going to come to a conclusion in shortly after, and at the time I wrote that first book, and realized, no, in fact, horrifically, the problem is much more severe and much greater. And so the Madeleva lecture was really an opportunity to make the case that this isn't just an isolated concern in one location, but in reality, it's a problem that's a global problem. I chose in my Madeleva lecture to focus on it in terms of not just Mexico, but to look at several Latin American countries. And I began the lecture by looking at the question of salvation. What is it that puts the question of salvation on our radars? And I wanted to begin with that, how often we experience evil, the suffering, pain, the fragmentary dimensions of life. And that pushes us to ask, is there something more? To frame it inside of that. And then on the far side, to begin looking at what more do we need to be thinking about in terms of salvation in light of this tragedy. I was influenced very much by a couple of points. One, Johann Baptist Metz published a chapter at one point in his life titled Christology After Auschwitz. And that really haunted me, that chapter of his, because it got me thinking, how do we talk about Christology and specifically salvation after feminicide or in the midst of feminicide, which is still the case today? And so that's what I was trying to do here. And my Madeleva lectures in 4 chapters. The first one talks about what puts the question of salvation on the map. And then providing a bit of narrative and background on these examples. And then finally, the last 2 chapters are really looking at what are the building blocks to rethink salvation that takes women's full humanity seriously, especially when it's experiencing the assault that we know from feminicide and the way that it sits inside of a culture that breeds violence and breeds misogyny, which is so true in so many places around the globe. So that's basically what I was trying to do, and to set the building blocks for what I hope will be a future work of mine, looking at social salvation, the notion that salvation must be understood in a social context, and looking at that more deeply in the future. So I'll stop there.
Listening to all 3 of you with such rich insights, one thing that just strikes me immediately is even though your lectures happened, 32 years ago, 24 years ago, 6 years ago, they all could have been given yesterday. I mean, these are to my mind, you know, the issues of ecological devastation, issues of silencing and overlooking women's authority in the church, and the issues of targeting violence against women simply because they are women are still so present to us. I wonder if, and we can have a free-flowing conversation here, if any of you would think differently about your lectures today, if you had given them yesterday, if you would approach them differently.
Maybe I'll jump in and say, my lecture, I think, would be even stronger along the lines that I originally spoke. I might mention that Paulist Press has reissued my Madeleva lecture last year because it was 30 years and a Spanish publisher wanted to translate it and bring it out in Spain with the proviso that I write an extended introduction as to what difference has 30 years made since I wrote this. So when I did that for the Spanish edition, Paulist Press went to bat and said, let's bring it out again with a new extended intro 30 years later. And to sit and think what has happened in 30 years, right? First of all, in terms of the earth, we're in a much worse situation now than we were 30 years ago in terms of climate change, climate warming. We just passed the 1.5 cutoff for increase in temperature that was agreed at the Paris Climate Agreement. Last year was the hottest year on record, and so on. So, and the extinction of species is increasing, and I don't need to talk about the fires in Los Angeles with Nancy here, and the droughts and the floods and the increased terror of this our planet becoming uninhabitable in places that is affecting people, human beings, especially poor people, especially women and their dependent children, but also all other species. So the situation is worse than it was. On the positive side, in terms of theology, we've had in the 10 years ago now, Laudato Si. And Pope Francis, in that encyclical, I make the point in the intro, I said, it's very seldom that a pope says what the church has been teaching is wrong. But Pope Francis says that, and he corrects our dominating attitude toward nature, talks about other creatures having not just instrumental value for our use, but intrinsic value of their own in God's eyes, and making them of religious importance, and so on. I think a few things in that encyclical I bring out are extremely important for women, earth, and creator spirit, right? There are two downsides I point out. One is that for over these 30 years, women have continued to make the connection between the treatment of women and the treatment of nature and our paltry understanding of God. And none of that scholarship appears in Laudato Si. In fact, there is not one footnote that footnotes contemporary women's scholarship in Laudato Si. That is a real failing. And the other difficulty there, at least in my mind, in terms of my own Madeleva lecture, is that Laudato Si doesn't try to work with images of God or understandings of God in a deeper way conceptually, to broaden out and make room in our spirituality to love nature in a different framework of understanding who God is in relation to nature. And to my mind, if we don't get to that point, it's always just going to be this additional thing that gets added on. I tell the story in the new introduction to my Madeleva lecture of taken from James Michener's novel The Source, and it's a story that took place in ancient times in the Middle East. These people had several gods, and one god required the sacrifice of infants in order to promote fertility in the field. And this one young woman is pregnant. She gives birth to a son whom she loves greatly. And the time comes for this ceremony, and her son is scheduled to be handed over, and she begs and she persuades and so on. Her husband would not listen. So at the moment of this great ceremony of the community, he takes the baby right out of her arms, hands it to the priest, and the priest put it in the flames. And she walks home in absolute horror and terror. And about 3 months later, there's another ceremony and she's at it and all. And finally, she just leaves. And here's the line in the novel. She says, "With a different God, my husband would be a different man." So it comes back to God. Like always, I think that's been the question of my theological life. And if we don't address that, then everything else, say other things about it, uh, but it doesn't get deep enough to get rooted in our heart and soul in terms of spirituality and practice, church teaching and civil law and so on. So I think I wanted to run with that in this new intro and say, if I were giving them how to leave a lecture again today, I would emphasize much more importantly, like with a different God, our people would be a different people. My husband would be a different man. It matters how we think about God in relation to the earth and in relation to women in order to have a more just and ecologically healthy world. There's more I said in the intro, which I won't go into now, because there's been a lot of theological development, such as deep incarnation, which I go into as well. But I think everything I said 30 years ago is in spades. I would say it again, only even stronger. Yeah.
So, do you want to go,
Either
Kathy?
Nancy, I'm fine either way. Did you want to follow up on Beth? If you did, go
Well,
ahead.
I think, I'm very intrigued by Beth always because her work that focuses our attention always on symbols and images at the deepest level and the way they shape our imagination, and especially the symbol of God. And I just think that is so on target for me in my own work. And so a couple of things I'll just comment on briefly. One, if I was going to do the Madeleva again, one place where my thinking has gone since I published the Madeleva is realizing, that the question of violence against women is not just a question outside of the United States, and which is a no-brainer. Of course, we realize that, but to look at where that is happening inside the United States today has been something that has haunted me. And I've done some more recent writing looking at questions related to Native American women and girls, what our tradition did around the doctrine of discovery, all of that kind of thing, and the way that has fueled our own story of feminicide inside the United States. And yet the sinfulness of our reality is that we are invisible to a lot of this kind of violence and suffering. And that invisibility really is evil. It's a function of sin, that's a collective sin, a scatosis, that's part of our reality today. And I think part of what we have to ask, which is, this is why I got so intrigued by what you were talking about, Beth, is the way that Christian symbols, how they contribute or challenge the tragedies that are happening in our world today, whether it's the earth, whether women, we need, or Native American peoples, we need to be thinking at that deeper level to really challenge what is going on today. So that's one place where my own thinking has gone, and also building very much on the question of symbols. I've been thinking much more about how a symbol like Our Lady of Guadalupe is used in our world today, and how that needs to change. So that's other work I'm doing, but related to the to the Madeleva. I think we need to look internally that one thing that my Madeleva did not do is necessarily to bring attention to the United States and our role in the tragedies that are going on.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah. I would say mine also was republished, but it was not decades later. It was in 2008. It was out of print, and a lot of Dominican groups, including my own and our associates, were very interested in using it. And the copyright was at the Center for Spirituality. And so but we made a case with Paulus Press about reissuing it or giving us the copyright so we could publish it. And again, they asked for, if so, a different introduction, since I had used the Madeleva lecture manifesto at the beginning. So I did write another introduction, and the beginning of it maybe summarizes that the more things change, the more these are still relevant. Let me put it that way. I hope they don't just remain the same, but consider the following. A church torn by internal divisions and scandals and in need of reform, led by ministers whose lives often fail to reflect the gospel they preach. A world in which violence of war is fueled by intertwined religious, economic, and political motivations, with factions on all sides lacking courageous leaders who are willing to work for the common good and call people to reform and dialogue. The survival of whole countries threatened by a pandemic plague and widespread poverty and disease, a burden borne especially by women and children. And then I went on to say, is this a description of the 21st century at this point, now global village, or of 14th century Europe and Italy's mystic, activist, and lay preacher, Catherine of Siena? I'm just making a connection with Nancy and Beth, especially about creation. There's also a rich theology of creation and use of creation imagery in Catherine of Siena, which if I were going to do something more now, Mary O'Driscoll's done something of that in a lovely pictorial resource on Catherine of Siena. But I myself, I think, could have and would want to try to rethink it today, both in light of things like the joy of the gospel, but also Laudato Si and ecological conversion. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing, somewhere in between that rewriting in 2008 and the Milligan lecture, which I gave at Nancy's at Loyola Marymount 2 years ago, I do keep coming back to Catherine of Siena, to the point I question myself and say, did I already say this there? And people said, well, if so, nobody probably read it anyway, so don't worry about it. Feel free. Or at least they don't say nobody, but not everyone here would be familiar with that. All right. So, but I found myself titling that one, A Time to Speak, A Time to Keep Silence, and a Time to Speak. But then, so I really go into the unholy silence and the being silence. That is nothing that is of God or that we want to promote for women, for men, for children, for, all right, anyone. But the keeping of silence. So the turn to the deep spirituality that was the mystical side of Catherine of Siena's mystical political work. And preaching. The other thing is that Colleen Griffiths from Boston College invited me at some point when other people, including, I believe, Beth and Nancy, contributed to that volume she had done at BC on prophetic witness, Catholic women's strategies for reform, right? Didn't both? Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
And Colleen, I said, no, Colleen, I've got many other things. She said, we need something in terms of spirituality to wrap this up. It's wonderful, and they are wonderful essays. That was in I think it was just 2009, if I looked at the right date right there. But at any rate, I went back to Catherine's dialogue in a different way and said, there are what not only enabled her to have the courage and the boldness and the endurance and suffer the result of the critique and recognized she had made some serious mistakes herself. And she died saying she was no longer sure what God was doing with her. I mean, in her own, so this mystic that everyone was turning to, including the popes, for advice, inside very much kind of like those Mother Teresa diaries at the end, and other great saints. So what enabled her? What sustained her? And I love that she really structured the whole dialogue in light of 4 prayers. So maybe I'll just wrap my part up here of just saying these have become, I find whatever I'm doing, if I'm invited to do something on Catherine of Siena, which is fairly frequent in the Dominican family, frequently, I find myself bringing this in because, for one thing, I was surprised that the first prayer, she says, is for herself. So you're thinking, oh, but the whole point of it is conversion. And it is, this authority didn't come out of the fact that she was perfect or had the perfect life or did everything correctly, or this meddling woman in the politics, et cetera, or again her own asceticism. The prayer is that she would be more deeply rooted in Christ, and who makes of us, and this is in her opening paragraph, another himself. She says it right there, by converting us in keeping us rooted in the truth and the love. So a soul rises up with a desire to be more deeply rooted in, and to do this through remaining in the, quote, cell of self-knowledge. But that cell of self-knowledge is not just psychological or self-help. It's very much being rooted in right relationship with God and those who are in our immediate circumstances. So the prayer for her own conversion, and I think by realizing she too needed the grace of God and relied on the grace of God and was preaching the gospel, not just political change, or then gives her the strength for the second prayer for the reform of Holy Church. And it's interesting, that her love of the church comes through, but it's really bold, and they're wonderful quotations. They are directly from her letters. So, but it's because she did love the church so much that she really desired the good leadership, and the transparency. She didn't use that word. We would use that today. She has a very important section in there that fits with the whole sexual abuse crisis, that people like Julia have done some wonderful work on that. And Catherine of Siena says to the Pope, the church is not speaking out on things that, and she's silence no more. It's silence that kills the world. And she uses the image of, if there's a wound in the body, and this would be the body of Christ, and you just cover over it rather than, I have the quote here, but I'm not going to take the time to, maybe I will, because I think it, yeah. She's saying why people, church leaders will not speak out about necessary church reform. They're afraid of forever of offending and making enemies, and all of this because of self-love. Sometimes it's just they would like to keep the peace. And this, I would tell you, is the worst cruelty one can affect. This is her. If a sore is not cauterized or excised when necessary, but only ointment is applied, not only will it not heal, it will infect the whole body, often fatally. So things like, but that kind of language is coming out of the love and the hope that change is possible and called for. All right, then the third one is for peace, and it's peace for the whole world as she knew it in her time, obviously not with our global, but that is so timely. And, so that praying for the peace of the world. And the final one is prayers for those that, and this is her language, we have been given to love with either a particular love, or another place, a special love, or it gets translated that way. And so there's, out of that chapter, that section of her writings, I've developed some other things and more articles and talks about friendship and how that we are actually the chapter in the prophetic witness book. I titled it On Not Losing Heart, with the struggles that everybody's writing, On Not Losing Heart, Catherine of Siena and the strategies, because this is a book about strategies, strategies of prayer and friendship. And I carry some of that over in a slightly different key in the other. So stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. In the time that remains, I wonder if we could turn our attention to the Madeleva Manifesto. And it might be interesting to know that the Madeleva Manifesto continues to inspire young women today, and even we have a program here at St. Mary's called Embody, where we host high school girls for a week during the summertime, and we close with an activity where we challenge the high school participants to write their own Madeleva Manifesto on the pattern of your original one in 2000. So it really is a living document. So I was curious, just in the little time that remains, if you had any reflections, and maybe we could start with you, Dr. Johnson, about being a part of composing the Madeleva Manifesto. And I know that Dr. Pineda-Madrid, that you weren't there yet, but you're an inheritor of that message. Yes. So I was curious to hear some of your reflections.
My memory is we gathered that weekend on the anniversary and so on, without any clue that we were going to write a manifesto. I mean, that wasn't the agenda. We were supposed to, I think, bring something forward for other people in the church, younger women to have hope or whatever. No. So we went around, it was like, what are we doing? Why are we, what? And trying this, trying that. And somebody finally, and I have a feeling, Kathy, you might remember, was it Joan Chittister that came up with the idea of a manifesto? And then we started going, the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, yes, let's do it. Let's go that way. We went, and it caught on, and then it started getting bolder and bolder, like the way things are now is not the way they have to be, and on and on. That's the opening, which is, sort of like a trumpet call, and on and on. And the more we did it, the better it got. But that did not start, the weekend did not start out to do that, is my memory. But once the notion of a manifesto got introduced, the genre then took over, and then we wrote what it is today, so it was, to my experience, a wonderful working of a group coming out in a place that we had not anticipated going when we went in. Yeah.
Wow. Beth, I'll tell you, my recollection of that is similar, except you and I went for a walk. I think we were kind of we had the pieces of it. Maybe but we didn't have the language of manifesto yet, because I said it to you on a walk around at St. Mary, and I was kidding. I was just doing I said, the Madeleva Manifesto, and you said, that'd be great. I said, oh, Beth, that really, and I'm the one, I'm saying, like, the communist.
So, Kath, it was you.
But also was you picking it up, because I was more,
and I'm thinking Joan. I can still see Joan Chittister rising.
Well, do you know what I remember about Joan? And this is actually probably more important, is we had there's a part in it that's where is the part about, yes, the Spirit calls us to a gospel feminism that respects the human dignity of all, and who inspires us to be faithful disciples, to stay in the struggle to overcome oppression of all kinds, whether based on gender, sexual orientation, race, or class. We wrote this in 2000, right? And again, the suggestion of someone who read it, right, because we were going to present it to an audience that night, we were on a panel, was, I wonder if maybe you don't want to include sexual orientation, because that might be, blah, blah. And Joan was so great. There were several people spoke to it, and people who had brothers and sisters and family members and who spoke, but But Joan was the one that said, I just want to, because the idea was the 16 of us would present that night. And what did they come up with this weekend?
Right.
And Joan said, if we drop sexual orientation, she said, I will not be signing and I will not be on the panel, and I will explicitly say why I'm not signing and why I'm not on the panel. So
Wow.
she spoke with authority, and it struck the right chord, even with the person. It wasn't a member of the 16 of us, but it was someone else who was concerned about the reception of it.
Right.
So that Joan, again, the prophetic voice. The other thing, last thing I would say is that last year, former Madeleva lecturers lecturers who are in the area are invited to the dinner. And last year we had the wonderful lecture by Natalia Imperatori Lee. And I think it was, is it Julianne Wallace, Julia, who's director mission?
Yes, she was the
Yeah.
vice president for mission.
Vice
Yeah.
president. She asked the three previous Madeleva lecturers who were present to read the Madeleva manifesto and she gave us each small sections as the grace before the meal. And so that was Gail Mandel, who wrote the piece on Madeleva One Woman's Life, and then Susan Ross and myself. And all of us were saying afterward how timely it still is, and that's wonderful, but that's also sad. So it's also the sense of that it is still so timely. Anyway, we're almost at the very last
Dr.
minutes.
Pineda-Madrid, did you want to add anything?
Just very quickly, I mean,
Okay.
I find it such an inspiring document. And part of what the manifesto, part of what really called my attention was the reimagining what it means to be the whole, and I think the word whole body of Christ is just such a rich imagery, and it just captures my imagination. So I was thinking about how do we take that and just really focus on that. And then the use of imagination and the need for imagination in this moment, which the manifesto certainly calls for. And I think, again, that's something that I would love to emphasize even further. That's what I'll say by way of a closure.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you for your original contributions to the Madeleva Lectures. They've all been so rich. I've really been blessed the last several weeks reviewing them in depth. They continue to be a gift to us and to the church. And I thank you so much for your contributions tonight and all of the work that you've been doing to revise your thinking since then. It's really quite a privilege to be able to speak with each one of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank
I
you,
also want
Julia.
to thank Dr. Daniel Horan for introducing us and managing all the tech. And I invite everyone who is watching this webinar to join us Tuesday, February 4th for our next installment in this series. And we'll have a third one as well. So I encourage you to look at our website, to look at all of our events and participate as we continue to celebrate our 40th anniversary year here at the center. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.